Alright, it's number our first critical thought of 2018. And to kick things off, I got a two-parter regarding a high-level discussion on UI design and some of the mystery surrounding it. Now, I'm still recovering from my cold, so there's a good chance we may be cutting for coughing and or me losing my voice. But UI or user interface design is one of the most underrated aspects of game development. It's also one of the hardest parts to actually sit down and discuss in terms of good and bad form and just what it means to make a UI in the first place. And we have certainly talked about this in spades before, and we'll be talking about this again most likely in the future, as there are many facets and subcategories we can get into. And if you guys have suggestions for some for me to cover later, please let me know in the comments below. But UI design, when it comes to video games, right off the bat, has an additional wrinkle to it compared to other industries and utilization. For most things, UI design is simply the on-screen element that you're looking at, be it an order form on an online store, typing into a computer, ordering computer parts, working at a restaurant or diner, you name it. But for video games, UI both means the on-screen elements as we just talked about, and the control scheme that you're using for your game, be it a keyboard and mouse, gamepad, or some other crazy invention that's out there. And when it comes to designing a UI, we're going to split up our talk today into two parts. This one we're going to be talking about the on-screen side of things, and we'll spend our next one talking more about the control scheme or layout then. But when it comes to the on-screen UI, there are several major points we want to touch on today. The first one is that the goal or the job of your UI is to provide the player with all the information they need in order to play your game. Now, there is a line between giving the player too much and too little information. On the worst end of the scale, or the too much, you could have a UI that basically tells a player, go here, mine this resource, wait 10 turns and attack here. Or you have a UI that's so bare bones that the player has literally no idea what they're doing. I've said this before, but there have been some games that I feel like I'm just pushing buttons and things are happening on screen. We don't know why. Now, when it comes to UI design and why it can be very difficult for developers to learn or to build a good one, there are several reasons why. I'm going to be attaching this to a post on Game Wisdom that will go into more detail on that front. But some of the major issues have to do with the first one being that there is no standardized element when it comes to good UI. Every video game, no matter what genre, platform, audience, you name it, will have a different UI structure. And it all comes down to the first question you need to ask yourself as a developer. What information does the player need to know in order to play my game? And right there, that can spawn dozens if not hundreds of other questions. Because the information you need to play a platformer like Mario is going to be vastly different from playing a third-person action game like Dark Souls. And even with games within the genre, different information may be more or less useful to the player depending upon the core gameplay loop. For instance, in a game like Diablo, or I'm sorry, not even a game like Diablo, but in other action RPGs or action games, the weight limit that the character is using can be a very important feature, and one that's usually displayed predominantly on the game. But for another title, let's say weight doesn't matter. You can have weight kind of as a lore option, but it's not critical to playing your game. Another case would be in Dark Souls, for instance. Imagine if you were playing Dark Souls and the game didn't tell you how many drinks of your Estus flask you had available. Imagine if you had to go into the game's inventory every time you wanted to check that. It would be a vastly different and more frustrating experience. Now, another reason why good UI design is very hard, and especially very hard when it comes to niche genres and audiences, is that there's this a mindset that complexity means a better game. And complexity can also be conflated to UI as well. As I just said a minute ago, a game like Dark Souls can be a very challenging game, but it's not a complex game to learn. Part of it has to do with how well the UI is laid out. And again, we wanted to spend time talking about that. That's its own video right then and there. But one of the most common criticisms or common reasons why developers don't do more in terms of UI design is that you can have your hardcore players crying foul, saying you're trying to dumb your game down because of it. And this gets back to that original point of what a good UI or what the service of a UI is. And that's to provide the player with all the information they need to play your game. And that right there could easily be a video unto itself, because that kind of philosophy is very important when it comes to game design. A go-to example that I always remember, and I mentioned this on the post, was when Blizzard was originally playing around the idea of showing you on screen, you must have 5 pylons built, or no, I'm sorry, not pylons, but you must have 5 workers mine this resource field. This Vespene gas can support 4. And a lot of hardcore players said that you were dumbing down the game or stuff like that. And this is a very important part about UI design. That if information is basically standardized among play and something that the player needs to know, it's very important to keep that on the game UI. For instance, if your game has, let's say, here's a perfect example. Let's say we're building an ARPG, and you use a variety of symbols to tell you what the modifiers are. You know, let's say you have a little flame indicator that shows it's a fire base. Let's say stars for arcane damage. $sign lets you get more trade for it. You know, stuff like that. That information should be available on the game's UI. You should not have the player have to go outside your game to learn crucial game elements. And this is why, for a lot of complex games, it can be a nightmare to learn, because the game will either assume you know all the stuff beforehand, or they will hide it within layers or multiple windows of information. And it is a craft to design a good UI. Excuse me. And a really great example, another one that I go back to, is Plants vs. Zombies, and how designer George Fan built that UI to make it so that anyone can learn it, even someone who has never played a video game before. And that takes us to another reason why good UI is very difficult. It is the intersection of art and design when it comes to a video game. And for a lot of people, they will assume that art is going to be mostly given to your artists or to your team of artists. But UI is a combination. And just because you have someone who's really good at designing characters or building environments or items doesn't mean they understand the philosophy of good UI design. And as the game developer, falls into your territory that you have to come up with. And it can be very hard to think like this. When we've spoken to John Breiger, I apologize for butchering your name there, on several live casts, we've talked about, when it comes to playtesting, how you need to be able to get useful information from players. Again, even if someone says something like, I hate your game, it's hard to follow, you have to be able to dig into that and figure out what makes your game so hard to understand. And right there is another major part. Playtesting is essential for UI design, because the only way you're going to learn whether or not people are following or understanding your game is if you get as many fresh eyes on it as possible. And being able to do this through early access, a closed beta, or even just taking your game to conventions and sending people down can be worth its weight in gold in terms of building your UI. And this is another major point, and that is a good UI doesn't magically happen. You will not wake up one morning and from a dream go, I'm going to move this UI UI interface. My mouth is still sick here. From here to here, and then you'll see the angel choir from above come down to signify that your UI is done. UI design is an iterative process requiring multiple disciplines and understanding the psychology and philosophy of when it comes to understanding how your game is played. It's not something you're going to figure out 20 minutes away from launching your game on Steam. And just like creating your core gameplay loop, the earlier in your game's process or your game's development that you figure out or settle on your UI structure ultimately will lead to a better game. And one of the biggest no-nos is doing massive UI redesigning or adding after your game is launched. Your game should not be at that point after release that you need to do a complete UI redesign, because that is very troublesome. Now, of course, you can add smaller features or quality of life options, but if you are completely rebuilding your UI 3 months after it's been out, it's not a good sign. But when it comes to UI design, there are, like I said, a lot of little things that can add up in big ways. And I don't want to name too many games, but there is one that I want to talk about, and that is Zombicide. And this was kind of the inspiration for this video, or this two-parter. Zombicide, again, is the latest game from Soldak Entertainment, and they have made some of the most complex RPGs out there. And my phone is ringing, so I'm going to take a quick break. I'll be right back. Alright, welcome back. So, getting back to the topic, Zombicide by Soldak Entertainment is the latest in the company's penchant for making very, very detailed ARPGs. They are some of the most complicated and some of the most deep and enriching ones on the market, and they certainly are even more complex than games like Path of Exile, Diablo 3, and even something like Grim Dawn. But the one area where these games tend to suffer is in the UI design. These games are very cumbersome and clunky to play. And it gets back to what I said at the beginning. It doesn't matter how great your game is if your UI design is keeping people away. And this is actually a really good mini example of just a small detail that can make your game easier to play. In Zombicide, like any ARPG, you have all the buffs and debuffs associated to a character. And what the game does, though, is that there is no unifying scheme as to what's a buff and what's a debuff. So when I'm looking on a character list over here, or on the enemy that I'm selecting up here, I just see a bunch of little icons underneath their health bar, and I have no idea at first glance what I'm looking at. Is this a buff for... Is this one a buff? Is this one a debuff? Who knows? And a very simple thing you can do is simply have an outline around the icon. Let's say green for buff, red for debuff. And that's it. Or even something like Grim Dawn, where all the buffs you have will be over here, all your debuffs are over there. It sounds very simple, and that's the beauty and nightmare of UI design, is that these touches are very simple, almost to the point that you think, why didn't I think of this before? But these little things can add up to make or break your UI. We've spoken before about the concept of affordances, or using common elements or common knowledge to structure a UI or structure how something works. For instance, if I have a lever, I'm going to naturally assume that to work that, I pull it or push it. Or a very famous one with ARPGs again is the use of red for health potions. We associate red as the color of blood, and it's the color that's used for your health bar at the bottom, so if a potion is red, we put two and two together. The same with mana. Imagine, for instance, if you played a game that you had a red health bar, a blue mana bar, but blue potions healed your health, red potions healed your mana. Or in terms of real life, imagine a green stop sign, or we change the lights to say that green means stop, red means go. And that's another, this goes back to what we were saying a few minutes ago, and we'll wrap things up, I think, in a minute. But a good UI is never complicated. You never want your game to be, you never want people to say that your UI is complex. And one of the things you have to understand when it comes to good UI design like this is that the easier you make it for someone to learn, and that is using these little tricks and little streamlining tactics, will ultimately make your game or make your UI better. And being able to figure out how to streamline and make things easier, that is probably several topics worth of discussions. But to wrap things up for today, and like I said, for our next talk, we'll talk more about the control scheme side of things. Good UI design is essential for any video game, and the best UIs are almost just seamless or seamlessly integrated into the game. And it's also why it's very hard to talk about great examples, because most people will focus on the negatives, the games that are so clunky or hard to play that they stop playing it. But for the games that it just feels like one-to-one, like I don't even look at the controller or the keyboard, you're probably too focused on the great game to think about the great control scheme. So I said this on Twitter, but I'm going to ask it here. For you folks watching this, can you think of examples of games that had really great UIs that won you over? Or games that had really horrible UIs that pushed you away? And speaking of which, like I said earlier, for your most hardened fans, they will be willing to put up with cumbersome or archaic UIs. Dwarf Fortress being a big example. It's a very deep game, but has a very hard to understand UI unless you grew up playing that kind of ASCII-like structure. But the fans have certainly gone around it. But if you were to put that in front of someone brand new, chances are they're going to walk away from it. Another really great example would be the original XCOM. That may be a hallmark of game design, but my god, that is a horrible UI in terms of trying to learn it. And while a great game or a great gameplay loop can compensate to some extent, you're basically throwing fans or throwing new players out the bus if you don't spend time working on your game's UI. And like I said, there's a lot we can go more into detail about, but this video is already getting a bit on the long end, so we'll wrap things up here. Thanks so much for watching. If you're, like I said, if you have suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comments below. But check back for daily discussions on game design here, and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/gwbicer. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.